Hey everyone, this is the Left-Libertarian. I've already done videos on the basics of left-libertarianism, so the information I cover will be more in depth. There is no reason to set my videos to music or moving images as I did in the past. You can find my primer on left-libertarianism in the link below or read the script at my blog. Institutions, Adaption, and Maximizing Internal Traits. Institutions have a profound influence over the lives of the individuals they govern. However, the public rarely talks about them or understands the concept of institutions. I would like to speak about the importance of institutions from a left-libertarian perspective, as the subject is sometimes neglected within libertarian circles. I will first define the institution and explain how they work. I then investigate how institutions influence society and how society influences institutions. I then cover the left-libertarian perspective on who should control institutions. Last, I introduce the idea that institutions should maximize particular human traits, and that left-libertarianism should be viewed as an evolving system with tendencies rather than specific institutional models. In the following, I draw mainly from institutional economics and philosophers such as John R. Searle, since they provide the most in-depth and comprehensive account of the subject. Institutional economics is an approach to economics that sees economic life as taking place within a social context and views human behavior as determined more by social factors than by deliberative individual thought. Jeffrey M. Hodgson defines institutions as durable systems of established and embedded social rules that structure social interactions. In short, institutions are social rule systems. They both constrain and enable behavior. Simply put, institutions are the structures within society that govern human interaction. Institutions can include things such as the government, Congress, executive, military, economic institutions, private companies, brokerage firms, the free market, money, legal institutions, private property, laws of the land, special purpose institutions, church, school, unions, and unstructured institutions such as family and friends. Many of the rules that govern society are unseen. In other words, they create norms and customs by which we live without our direct knowledge of their existence. For instance, if one were to walk into a business seminar, individuals don't need to be told to remain sitting, not to constantly interrupt the speaker, or make obscene noises, even though there is no explicit rules before entering. Concert goers realize the same rules do not apply as a business seminar, and that it might be customary or even desired to act rowdy. Therefore, if we change the institution, we change the way people interact with others, how they behave, and ultimately how they think. When we look at institutions, we are penetrating behind the surface of the world we live in to see the rules that constitute our social lives. But the rules are very different from those of physics. Institutional rules aren't embedded in the physical world like the laws of gravity. If institutional rules are not embedded in nature, where do they come from? I hesitate to give too much of a philosophical account of this subject because it would be too time-consuming, but I will at least give a brief description. We can define three primary structures which underlie institutions: collective intentionality, status function, and constitutive rules. Philosopher John Searle suggests that institutional rules have their existence because people have come to collectively accept or recognize a particular status given to the institution. These are referred to as collective intentionality, sometimes called intersubjectivity. For example, enough people in the U.S. believe in the institution called the presidency, so collectively, people have come to believe there is such an institution and will act accordingly by voting or recognizing George Washington as the first U.S. president. Secondly, a status function is when humans have the capacity to assign functions to objects, where the object does not have the function intrinsically, but only in virtue of the collective assignment. For instance, a $100 bill is just a piece of paper, but it has a status because enough people have come to believe that it has a particular function and that we can use that function to carry out particular tasks, such as buying groceries. Last, we have constitutive rules, which are a number of guidelines and procedures such as driving on the right side of the road, rules of the game, or hierarchical private companies. While institutions can be extremely complex and vary from states to paper money, the principles that underlie the constitution of social reality are rather few in number. These three classes of institutions can be said to consist of a single unifying principle, analogous to the atom in physics or DNA molecule in genetics. As I mentioned above, the topic is a bit more complex, but the important point to realize is that human beings give power to institutions, and they exist because we collectively accept them. A more specific question to ask is, why do we have institutions in the first place? There are a number of answers to this question, but for the most part, people benefit from institutions because they make life easier, and they allow individuals to associate with one another to materialize their desires. We have gone from the days of hunting and gathering to acquiring massive wealth. As libertarian socialist Robin Hahnel states, institutions are the necessary consequence of human sociability. Any institutional boundary makes some individual choice easier and others harder, and therefore infringes on individual freedom to some extent. But abolishing social institutions is impossible for the human species. I would like to return to the possibility and how an institution infringes on individual freedom later. Many institutions are specifically designed or engineered to bring about particular results. Capitalism is a system that distributes wealth and power. The state acts as a monopoly on the use of force to control certain behaviors. These institutions could be said to contain elements of rational action because they are designed with a number of rules, incentives, and relationships of power in order to create end results. In most cases, the people who design the institution or those who head the institution tend to benefit the most from them. Over time, institutions become normalized, and individuals in society come to believe that the institutions that guide them are somehow natural or God-given. However, most institutions are the creation or byproducts of human beings. In many cases, institutions become completely entrenched in society and within the minds of individuals. Historically, as institutions age, they become invisible and people stop recognizing how they control human action. In short, institutions just become part of the societal landscape. But even when one does recognize institutions, even unjust ones, people despair of ever being able to change it. Yes, the distribution of property is unjust, and perhaps there is something unjust about the institution of private property itself, but there isn't much that the individual can do about it, so the individual tends to feel helpless in the face of the institution. Institutional effects on society and society's effects on institutions. In the following paragraph, Searle demonstrates the number of institutions that surround us by italicizing institutions Searle interacts with throughout his day. I get up in the morning in a house jointly owned by me and my wife. I drive to do my job on the campus in a car that is registered to both of us. I can drive legally only because I am a holder of a valid California driver's license. On the way, I illegally answer a cell phone call from an old friend. Once I am in my office, the weight of institutional reality increases. I am in the philosophy department of the University of California in Berkeley. I am surrounded by students, colleagues, and university employees. I teach university courses and make various assignments to my students. The university pays me, but I never see any cash because my pay is deposited automatically into my banking account. After my lecture, I go to a restaurant and I use my credit card to pay the bill. When I get back to campus, I telephone my insurance agent about my homeowner's policy, and I also call my travel agent to arrange airline tickets for an invited lecture at a professional society. I accept an invitation to a dinner party. As one can see, humans are embedded into a world of institutions, many of them constituting the way we act, live, and socialize with others. What's interesting to note here is how little control we have over institutions, but how much power they exert over individuals in society. Individuals are surrounded by unseen mechanisms that control human behavior and compel them to act in certain ways. Depending on the institutions, they can help to liberate us or cage us like rats in a maze. Does that mean that institutions predetermine personality, habits, thoughts, etc.? The answer is simply no. People who believe that institutions predetermine individual personality reduce them to mere automatons, remove human agency, and neglect to see the mechanisms by which individuals change institutions. Over the course of time, humans do tend to alter institutions, especially when we consider that many ancient institutions no longer exist, such as aristocratic feudalism or certain forms of slavery. People do influence institutions, but only indirectly. At the same time, we keep them functioning because we participate in them. In effect, by getting married, a couple unintentionally helps to reproduce the institution of marriage. By going to work, the worker unintentionally helps to reproduce the social relationship of wage labor and capital. By paying rent, the tenant unintentionally helps to reproduce the social relationship of landlord-tenant. Thus, social structures constrain and enable the very practice through which they are reproduced. It would be convenient to say that we could simply stop participating in unwanted institutions to dispose of them. However, reality is more complex, especially when you have to account for the fact that human survival depends on working for someone else to receive wages. We have to pay taxes or go to jail, or conform to specific customs or be ostracized. Another problem develops because there is an interconnected system where economic systems connect to the state apparatus. Social customs are formed by education, family, and church, and all of these institutions influence one another. As Richard Wolff states, the economic aspects of society influence the non-economic, and the reverse holds true as well. For example, economic considerations certainly influence decisions about marriage and family considerations likewise influence the economic decisions people make. Economic calculations affect U.S. foreign policies, and foreign policy decisions make their marks on the economy as well. In other words, this view assigns no priority to economic over non-economic aspects of society as determinants of one another. All the different aspects shape and are shaped by all the others. No one part of society, neither the economy nor any other part, determines the whole of society. In other words, to act within one institution helps to reproduce other institutions, which thereby changes social norms, customs, and culture. In effect, one is unknowingly participating in reproducing systems of control with little influence or guidance. Who should control institutions? At this point, I would like to introduce the left-libertarian perspective on the subject of institutions. Thus far, we have discussed what institutions are, how they function, and how they reproduce over time. Individuals are born into a number of institutions which guide their life, thoughts, habits, customs, beliefs, and human action. Why should it be that individuals are born into institutions, or that they have very little influence over them? The answer is pretty straightforward, especially when we are talking about our main institutions such as the state, including the military, executive, legislation, private companies, private property, organized religion, media, and the educational system. All of the above have an organized hierarchy where power and control is distributed to the few, and those members directly benefit from such organization. An owner of a private company or the head of a church have little to no incentive to change the organization. Instead, they exert massive power and control over the people they govern. In many cases, institutional heads have been willing to use violence to uphold their power and status. If it is true that institutions have massive control over the individual and society, it seems reasonable to say that the people who are shaped and affected by institutions should be the ones who directly control them. However, institutions are a social phenomenon which influences a number of people. The only way to have individuals influence institutions is by giving them direct control over them. The above implies two important left-libertarian concepts. The first concept implies that power is evenly distributed within the organization. For instance, in the case of the firm, all members share power rather than redistributing power to the top of a hierarchy. Secondly, those affected by the institutions should have control directly proportional to how it affects their life. To simplify this concept, let's take a local community. It seems that I should have more influence over my local community than a community 500 miles away. What I am suggesting is that the individual should be the ones who design and engineer the institutions that influence their life. Only individuals have the incentive to make institutions fit their specific needs and the desire to fulfill their wishes. The above necessitates a complete transformation of our main institutions, especially since the vast majority of individuals have little say over the mechanisms that control their life. The ecological, cultural, or economic problems facing the world today are so severe, tinkering with our institutions is no longer a viable option. Times have changed, especially in the last 200 years, yet our institutions remain relatively the same. This is analogous to using a donkey to plow fields when we have better alternatives. Emma Goldman explains, "Our institutions and conditions rest upon deep-seated ideas. To change those conditions and at the same time leave the underlying ideas and values intact means only a superficial transformation, one that cannot be permanent or bring real betterment. It is a change of form only, not of substance." One common objection is that people are not smart enough to create their own institutions because they lack intelligence. There are a number of responses to this objection, most of which are outside the scope of this video, but a couple of points should be made. First off, we don't need to ask if people are intelligent enough because left-libertarian institutions have already existed and many of them remain today. We have schools where students K through 12 self-manage their education without any problems. During the Spanish Civil War, large parts of Spain became self-managed from the workshop to the community, again with very few problems. In places like Argentina, workers took over abandoned factories during an economic collapse and started production without hierarchy with huge success. We even have common lands being used that are self-managed, such as community gardens. Secondly, institutions have what might be called a constitution, with a number of rules, guidelines, and goals. Once the constitution is established, members of the organization act within the framework. Last, left-libertarians are not demanding that institutions be abolished, but they should be organized differently. Institutions can be, or should be, specifically engineered to bring about particular results because they lock into human rationality. Institutions are social conventions, and they don't appear out of nowhere. They are usually designed, and those designs benefit the people who logically construct them. The question to ask is, what should institutions be designed to do? Institutions and the maximization process. As stated before, institutions infringe on individual freedom to some extent. Institutions are a byproduct of social interaction, and even giving a gift or speaking a particular language fall within the category of an institution. Therefore, institutions are a permanent aspect of society. Robin Hahnel makes the point that the relevant question about institutions, therefore, should not be whether we want them to exist, but whether any particular institution possesses unnecessary oppressive limitations or promotes human development and fulfillment to the maximum extent possible. In my opening paragraph, I stated that institutions should maximize particular human internal traits, and that left-libertarianism should be viewed as an evolving system with tendencies rather than specific models. Institutions can bring about certain traits within individuals who interact with them. In effect, an institution can empower the individual and allow certain behaviors, social norms, thoughts, and emotions to flourish. For instance, worker self-management produces positive social attributes such as cooperation and autonomy. On the other hand, private companies tend to maximize negative human attributes such as selfishness and paternalism. While I'm painting with a broad brush and each case is different, on the aggregate, these traits do tend to appear in individuals within these institutions. To maximize something means to increase as much as possible. When I say the maximization process, I mean that we create institutions that maximize particular traits and values that allow for human flourishing. The maximization process shouldn't be considered a hard and fast rule or even a specific model. In fact, each institution is very different, and some attributes may not be needed or even wanted depending on the organization. In each case, individuals design the institution as rationally as possible with the goal to provide particular outcomes. It is important to realize that institutions and organizations work within a framework, so there are boundaries that institutions must work within. Institutions are vastly complicated networks. Economic institutions affect non-economic institutions, and so on. The goal of left-libertarianism is to maximize positive human attributes within rational limits rather than antisocial ones. Left-libertarians believe that many of our current institutions produce negative traits within the individual. To quote Kropotkin, "When we ask for the abolition of the state and its organs, we are always told that we dream of a society composed of men and women better than they are in reality. But no, 1,000 times no. All we ask is that men and women should not be made worse than they are by such institutions." Again, this points to the need for individuals to design institutions rather than the select few who design them in their own self-interest as they do today. Which attributes should we maximize within individuals? As stated before, there is no set rules. Most left libertarians may suggest liberty be maximized in all cases, but I believe this to be naive in some cases. There are many other values such as well-being, fraternity, self-directedness, integrity, honesty, justice, responsibility, reciprocity, equality, and other values that lead to an enriching life. The whole point of left libertarianism is to find positive traits and values and maximize them within rational limits so they are expressed within the individuals that interact with the institution. There is also the question of how institutions evolve over time and why they survive in the first place. Anything that replicates itself or reproduces itself with slight modification, such as DNA, by definition will evolve over time. Institutions are no different. They replicate themselves and are slightly modified over the course of time. Institutions shouldn't be viewed as static, but dynamic systems that require alterations to make changes to the real world. The term evolution is sometimes equated with progress. However, Hodgson observes that evolution does not drive towards some goal or destination. Instead, it carries the baggage of its past in a typically haphazard, ongoing process of adaptation and selection. It is important to dispense with all mistaken notions of evolution as an optimizing, goal-driven, or necessarily progressive process. One of the major problems with the state is that it has a hard time adjusting to changes. Part of the reason for this factor is that states are extremely large, centralized, and bureaucratic due to top-down planning. Furthermore, because of the size of the state, when it makes a mistake, such as an economic mistake, it doesn't just affect a small part of the whole, but everything it governs. Left libertarians suggest that organizations be smaller, decentralized, and bottom-up institutions. This type of organization is more suitable and adaptable to changes that happen in the real world. Private enterprise also suffers because entrepreneurs lack sufficient knowledge of other market actors, use centralization and top-down planning, which minimizes the information and knowledge pool of its employees while also creating bureaucracies. Kropotkin has also shown that survival of the fittest, a phrase coined by Herbert Spencer rather than Darwin, plays a much smaller and decisive role than mutual aid. Instead of a society based on survival of the fittest, it would be better to have institutions based on resilience. Resilience is the capacity of a system to absorb disturbances and reorganize while undergoing change, so as to retain essentially the same function, structure, identity, and feedbacks. Cooperation taps into knowledge pools which we otherwise wouldn't have, while also taking advantage of localization. In any case, it seems odd to subject individuals and society to survival of the fittest, as though it's some positive virtue. It's not. I suggest that left libertarian institutions dispense with many of the negative attributes, such as lack of information, a purely survival of the fittest mechanism, and a move towards optimization, localization, cooperation, transparency, resilience, mutual aid, and rational goal setting. I would like to suggest that left-libertarianism has tendencies towards particular institutions rather than rigid institutional models. By tendencies, I mean an inclination towards a particular characteristic or type of behavior. There are many types of institutions, and it would be impossible to build models of each of them because the institution of money is vastly different from the institution of capitalism or the state. Today, there are major dissatisfactions with our political and economic institutions, especially because the public has little ability to control their institutions, and some even feel imprisoned by them. Instead, left-libertarianism believes that those affected by the institutions should be the ones to design them within a particular framework. The framework uses institutions not to create invisible cages, but to maximize positive internal traits. It is finally time for left-libertarians to start to talk about alternative institutions. If we spend 95% of our time talking about the evils of the world and only 5% giving an alternative, we will sow apathy, helplessness, and powerlessness within society. While left-libertarian slogans such as "against all authority" are perhaps clever, they are only that, slogans. In reality, left-libertarianism is a socio-economic and political movement which has tendencies towards the liberation of every human being.